So good afternoon, everyone in Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Good evening in Asia. We have quite a few people coming in from Asia today, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. My name is Martin Perbrick, and I'll moderate the discussion today. And I think I should say, rather than moderate on a topic that's extremely complex, introduce those experts who are on our panel would be a more appropriate way to describe my role today. But with us to help are Roddy Gow, Chairman and Founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, also Rick Minchom, Head of Development at Asia Scotland Institute. And our focus today is a discussion of the Third Pole, how climate change is affecting the Tibetan Plateau and beyond the Tibetan Plateau, I think, as we'll see shortly with the water supply that involves. The region that encompasses the Hindu Kush mountain range and Himalayas is the Tibetan Plateau, and is widely known as the Third Pole because its ice fields contain the largest reserve of fresh water outside the polar regions. The Third Pole is often also referred to as Asia's water tower, feeding major rivers such as, huge rivers I should say, such as the Ganges, Indus, the Yangtze, and the region is the source of 10 major river systems that provide irrigation, power, and drinking water to over 1.9 billion people in Asia, so around 25% of the world's population. So obviously the importance of that is huge for the sustainability of communities and cities in that region. And all of our panelists have great insight, I think, into this area and the issues involved. Dr. Martin Mills is Senior Lecturer in Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen, in Scotland, I should add, Director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. He specialises in the comparative organisation and structure of governance in religious, state and medical institutions. Dr. Mills' principal focus for research is the anthropological study of Tibetan communities, in particular in religious and governmental institutions. He's the author of Identity, Ritual and State in Tibetan Buddhism, the Foundations of Authority in Gelugpa monasticism, and has carried out fieldwork in Tibet, Ladakh, China, Northern India, and Scotland over the last 30 years. I add the "and Scotland" obviously deliberately, but it's from Dr. Mills's biography. Secondly, we have Professor Maharaj Kristan Pandit, who is CEO, Institution of Eminence, Dean and Chair of Research Council and Director at the University of Delhi, and joining us from Gurgaon, actually just outside Delhi today. He is Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University and Distinguished Visiting Professor at the National University of Singapore. A very busy series of roles, I suspect, Raj.
Can you stop there?
Yes, I'll stop there. Yes, but he's very active, a renowned expert on Himalayan ecology, the environment and sustainability, and I think I'd only mention one of his major research projects. The long-term research on the Himalaya found expression in a Nature article in 2020, the title of which is "The Himalaya Should Be a Nature Reserve," and that was published last summer. And last but not least, Mr. Tempa Gyaltsen Zamla, Deputy Director of the Tibet Policy Institute, who also heads the Environment and Development Desk at the Tibet Policy Institute. His research focus is on socio-environmental impact of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau, and he's written about this extensively and taken part in many United Nations presentations on the subject. I think more importantly, perhaps, Tempa and his forebears are from the Himalayas, which makes his voice most important for today. So we're very grateful to you, Tempa, and Raj and Martin for joining us. So just to remind all attendees, we're on the Zoom webinar platform, so your videos and microphones can't be displayed or heard, and only the panelists can. But we do want to hear from you, and after the introductory remarks, we'll bring in your questions if we could. So please could you post questions in the Zoom chat function anytime you wish, and we'll make a note of them and get to them as soon as we can. If I might say in Zoom chat, questions are preferable to comments, if you don't mind. Comments are nice, but we really want to hear your questions. So Martin, could we start with you? Would you like to give us an overview of the situation, the Third Pole, what it means, and based on your work in the past? Thank you.
Sure, yes, thank you, Man. Yeah, just as a sort of further word of introduction, much of the work that I'll speak to just now, which will be largely introductory, comes from the fact that in addition to my academic work, I have also for the last 5 years acted as Secretary of the Cross-Party Group on Tibet for the Scottish Parliament, for which in the last 2 years we were asked to carry out a kind of review of the scientific literature on climate change in the Third Pole region. This involved a review of more than 900 publications, and we were really kind of looking for the consensus in the big picture side of things, but particularly with reference to questions such as the water resource question and the effects on surrounding regions across Asia of changes on the Tibetan Plateau. So I'm just going to share some slides here just to give us a sort of sense of this. Here we have the Tibetan Plateau sort of en masse, as it were. It's this region here. Just to give you a sort of sense of it, the Tibetan Plateau itself is 1 million square miles. So that makes it, roughly speaking, the size of Western Europe. It's generally speaking about 4,000 meters above sea level. It was created when India crashed into Eurasia about 52 million years ago. The Third Pole region is the cryosphere or ice field region that encompasses both the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding mountain regions around it. So that's that sort of large area there. And if, so it's slightly larger still, so really about 3/4 of the size of Europe. When we speak about the Third Pole, we're speaking about, as Martin said, the largest supply of fresh water outside the 2 other poles. I would hasten to add here, this is the only such supply, however, that has half of the world's population sitting on its doorstep and is vital in that regard. That sort of supply of water we refer to scientifically as a cryosphere. The cryosphere comprises largely glaciers, which you will all have known about, I'm sure, snow, obviously, and more particularly, and this is something that we've been working on quite a lot recently, the underlying permafrost. This is permafrost here. It's actually technically frozen ground, but if ground freezes for a large period of time, the water begins to separate out, and you actually do end up with quite deep, really underground icebergs. And if we go to areas such as, for example, Siberia, when I say quite deep, I mean these can go as deep as 1.5 kilometers, a huge ice wedge. That really can go down a long way. Once you've got past that first bit of earth that can warm during the summer, called the active layer, underneath you've got this huge ice supply. And all of this is fresh water that is produced by the water cycle that most of you will probably remember from your school days, of the way in which sort of water evaporates from the seas. It travels towards colder, higher areas where it falls as precipitation. And there it gets trapped, particularly on the Tibetan Plateau, it gets trapped as ice, which gradually melts throughout the year. And this is the real sort of, in a sense, the significance of the Tibetan Plateau for almost all of Asia in water terms, that what it does is it performs a regulatory function. Effectively speaking, the Tibetan Plateau, as Martin pointed out, stands at the heart of Asia. Here it is, roughly here. This green patch is actually the entire mountain range itself that was caused by that collision between India and Eurasia. It stands at the heart of Asia, and off it come almost every single major river in Asia. So the Irrawaddy, the Mekong, the Salween, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Indus, the Tarim, the Yellow, the Yangtze, all of these rivers flow off the heights of the Tibetan Plateau or their surrounding regions. And they flow from that gradual melting of that ice. The rains and snow fall on the Tibetan Plateau and its surrounding regions only through some months of the year. And the ice and the cold actually keep them there and allow them to trickle down throughout the rest of the year, which provides stability to all of those rivers throughout the rest of the year. If the Tibetan Plateau effectively warmed up completely, you would only get those rivers for some months of the year and not for the rest. And this is important because, the fresh water that comes off, which is only a tiny proportion of the water that's available to us on Earth. It's about 2.3% of water on Earth is actually fresh water, and fresh water is what the human race lives by, effectively speaking. It isn't just about drinking water. You can't put fresh water, you can't put salt water into a machine because it'll break. You can't put it onto fields because it'll make them sterile. Effectively speaking, that tiny freshwater supply, that 2.3%, is what all human civilization depends upon. So it's a really crucial function. It's not just about drinking water. While, for example, each of us in Britain drinks, well, we use about 142 litres in the UK per person in terms of the water that actually comes into our houses, than we use for our taps and everything on those lines. We use for showers, we drink it and everything on those lines. But the average person in the UK uses 5 tons of water a day, of fresh water a day. They use it in the water that is required for the bread that's in their pantry. All of that food requires water to produce. Your electricity requires water to go into the electricity power station. All of that, if you add all of that up, it's actually about 5 tons of fresh water used and largely converted into polluted water every single day of our lives. So these are the numbers, and they're quite scary numbers as far as that's concerned, most particularly if we think about the Tibetan Plateau, because the Tibetan Plateau is warming up. This is something that has been really registered for a long time, and the curve for the gradual growth in temperature across the Tibetan Plateau is most sensitive, actually goes back almost 150 years, but is particularly marked in the last 60. As you can see here, it's pushing above that 0 degree mark. And this is a very generalized sort of average, because we're looking at such a wide field. And this is a kind of crucial element to this. That line there, that 0 line, that's our threshold, that's our tipping point, because of course, very simply, that's the point where ice turns to water. And that is the point where the cryosphere begins to lose its consistency and therefore lose its function in regulating the water supplies to Asia as a whole. Now, we've actually seen this kind of across the board, and it is a substantial problem. Obviously, you will have heard about the glaciers disappearing. The general calculation is that the majority of the glaciers in the Third Pole region will be gone by the end of the century. That includes what is often referred to as the Karakoram anomaly. There was an area where there appeared to be some increase in glacial mass in the very west of the Tibetan Plateau. But even that has changed in the last few years, and that Karakoram anomaly appears to have been disappearing. Similarly, and here I am going to try and do this. Sorry, I'm going to move things around slightly. There we go, so that I can. Similarly, on the permafrost side of things, if we look at the permafrost map of deep distribution, about 5 meters down, this is roughly speaking what the permafrost distribution across the Tibetan Plateau looked like in the 1960s. The deep blue areas are deep, rich, cold permafrost. The red areas are in the process of thawing. And this is roughly speaking what it looked like in the 2000s. So we have a very significant shift and destabilization of the underground permafrost in the Tibetan Plateau region. And that permafrost holds a major function in the way in which water is organized with reference to rivers. Effectively speaking, it redistributes water and acts as a floor to water supplies across the Tibetan Plateau. And one of the things we've discovered in the last few years, largely through NASA's GRACE follow-on project, which look at the distribution of gravity and particularly water gravitational sources around the world, is that the Tibetan Plateau is beginning to act like a sponge to water. It is increasing in water weight by between 7 and 9 gigatons a year, okay? And that water is effectively speaking staying put on the Tibetan Plateau. And we're beginning to see very significant destabilizations of major rivers like the Indus, the Yellow River in particular in the northern plateau, but the Yangtze as well. Many of these rivers are really beginning to become unstable and unreliable in the way in which they provide water for the wider Tibetan and Asian populace. And that's 225 million people around the Third Pole, 1.9 billion people require the water, and 4.9 billion of us require the things that are produced by those watersheds as major elements of our subsistence around the world. So that is actually really kind of half the world population. Okay, I shall leave it there on that happy note.
Martin, thank you very much. Partly for the Geography 101, which I need after 40 to 50 years having not been in school, but quite a stunning Geography 101, I think, for that that particular issue, especially how much water we do use in our own country.
It's striking, isn't it?
Which exactly, and it's quite troubling when we put it in that perspective. Which I think is the importance of this period around COP26, to remind us all of the issues that relate to us directly, and how we contribute to contribute to climate change. Raj, could we hand over to you next, please?
Thank you.
A few seconds to get. I know you want to show some slides for a slightly different perspective, I think, and slightly different issues, but if I could give you your own time to speak, please.
Yeah, so can you see the slide?
Very clear, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so what I'll do is that I'll quickly go through these slides and maybe keep talking, and then we can have a broader discussion. Now, this is about how climate change is impacting Himalayan and Tibetan biodiversity, and ultimately how it is impacting Tibetan culture. So I will just keep it simple to one part of this thing. So I will start with a tale which is way back in 2005 when we were traveling in Sikkim and we were in high altitude. And at that point of time, there was a landslip, major landslip. Our vehicles couldn't travel. So we went up the mountain, and surprisingly, I found this very curious looking plant. And then we, of course, found that it was Ceropegia. And we got into finding literature, what was happening, why this plant is there, because it was almost a tropical plant and a subtropical plant. What was it doing at that height, which was quite high up in the Himalaya? Anyway, that got us into a major project, which we did. Ultimately, we were trying to botanize a place which was worked by a couple of British, naturalists at the point of time in late 18th century, and we looked at two valleys in Sikkim, Lachung, Lachan valleys, and at the end of 3, 4, 5 years, we found that there was a perceptible range shift happening in a large number of species. So a large number of species, their lower elevations had gone quite high up. They were moving north, and as a result, there was crowding happening in upper reaches. So on an average, species had moved roughly about 400 to 500 meters north in search of cooler weathers, cooler temperatures. So, and a number of these species, which many of them adorn the gardens of Europe, and they had disappeared, or they were on the verge of disappearance. So these are some of the plants which we found were hardly now limited. Their geographic ranges had significantly limited. Their populations had gone down. A number of them had almost. And of course, intricately linked with this biodiversity, as you know, are the lifestyle, our lives and lifestyles of the people there. And subsequently, another student of mine, he was looking at what was happening to when we were looking at what kind of species were ingressing into higher elevations. And we, to our surprise, we discovered that in fact all these meadows where we find these, most of these animals, and which are the grassy habitats, they were being ingressed by, shrubby plants, which were mostly invading into what is called the herbland or the meadows. So they were slowly getting converted into. So we did some modeling studies and came up with some kind of very scary situation that ultimately, over a period of time, we might lose most of these habitats, these alpine meadows in the Himalaya and up Trans-Himalaya, which is the Tibetan Plateau. And so that was an academic, of course, exercise, but then what would be the impact? So we looked more deeper into these issues, and this is a picture which was taken possibly in 1960s by my teacher. And then what is the current status in a place called Valley of Flowers. So you can see slowly the shrubby layer and woody layer getting into these habitats. And one consequence which we published last year was 2 years back. One of the consequences was that whatever species we have, and let me tell you also that largest number of endemic species are those species which are found only there and nowhere else in the world. So largest number of endemic species are at those elevations. So they are faced with double whammy. One, they are only found there. The second one is because of the climate change that is happening, and we found it very clearly, empirically, we found evidence that winter was becoming warmer. Summer temperatures, we didn't find much of a change, but temperatures during winter were relatively warmer. And as a result of it, what we found was that large number of these protected areas in the Himalaya would be almost non-functional, because species which have to be protected are living somewhere else, are living outside their boundaries. So we suggested that we may have to redraw the boundaries of these protected areas, and that. So that again was a kind of these were scientific findings. But with this, we were getting concerned because in this area, we know that yak is the critical or the keystone species. Peopling of Himalaya and Tibetan Plateau is intricately linked to yak. No yak, no highland population. It's very clear. That is central to that. We wanted to know more and more about it, and we found as the meadows where yak, is mostly found, when they get, they shrink. What happens is that then this is what will happen. Now, I'll just briefly tell you why is yak important, because it produces more volume in terms of dung than any other animal, and it has the highest calorific value. And it is used both because there is very little, because of the Tethyan area, there is very little organic matter in the soil. Therefore, this is critical organic matter. And that is why those areas, whether they are in India or in Tibetan Plateau, so much of those soils become fertile because of the yak dung. And of course, there is no fuel wood at that elevation. Now there will be enough fuel wood, but there will be no yak. Okay, so now the point is that what is likely scenario? The likely scenario is that as the temperatures increase, more and more woody elements will get into these alpine meadows. Alpine meadow, mostly these grasses and sedges, and that is part one. So they will mostly be squeezed. They will go extinct, and yak will have the basic trophic structure of yak will be gone. And once yak is gone, the entire lifestyle of Tibetans and Himalayan highland, population communities would have been decimated, because they wouldn't know. Of course, there are other pressures which I do not want to go at this point of time. So there is a pressure on the language of Tibet. So there is that kind of pressure. Then they are being moved around here and there. Rehabilitation, resettlement, being taken out from these. But there is happening at the natural level and also at whatever governance level. So if you remove yak, if you remove those grasses and sedges, that is part one. Part two is most of these Himalayan highlands or Tibetan meadows have largest proportion of these species are also medicinally important. That is the first resource. So either people use it as a first resource, that means to have ready cash, they will go harvest them and have some ready cash with them, or they use it because given the kind of healthcare system that we have at those elevations, so that is the immediate medicinal system which they depend on. So a disappearance of these Himalayan meadows and Tibetan meadows would mean not only is the keystone animal called yak gone, with which is linked the tradition and culture of Tibetan people. The second thing is there is a straight onslaught on the local medicinal or health delivery system, which we are unable to replace. So since we cannot have a modern system there, one is that through government interventions, we are taking away that natural health delivery mechanism from there. On the second hand, nature also is not very, very kind. So nature is moving a large swathe of these invasive shrubs into those Himalayan highlands. So I think that therefore, when we talk about climate change, we should not see as if it's a kind of a fetish with scientists or those who say, oh, okay, we have published a paper here and there or something like that, as Martin mentioned. So it's not about that. It is intricately linked to people's lives and livelihoods. So we have to do whatever is possible in our limited ways, because ultimately policymakers should have something. They say that bring us down to some kind of number. So we have to give them numbers. How many species are going extinct? What would it mean in terms of health delivery system, local health delivery? What would it mean in terms of culture? So that's what. So I just want to, what is happening, because a little bit, it is not, I will stay clear of politics, but I will all the more say something here. You see, the problem, as most of you would know, that there are different countries who are sparring currently on boundary issues on both sides. So I found this, I wrote it in my book. If some of you have a copy of a book called Life in the Himalaya, an Ecosystem at Risk, published by Harvard University Press. So this is a very wonderful, writing by Simone Weil. She says, two prisoners whose cells adjoin communicate with each other by knocking on the wall. The wall is the thing which separates them, but it is also the only means of communication. What I write is that it is true, because the Himalaya is the wall that nations could use as the means of communication. The two largest Asian nations have immensely benefited from the two huge river systems, the Brahmaputra and the Sindh, or Sangpo as they call it in Tibet, which are rising in the Tibetan Plateau. The subcontinent owes its cultural and civilizational progress to these rivers from across the mountain. Tibet and China also have the prodigious fortune of following the philosophy and teachings of one of India's best-known sons, Gautam Buddha. Formidable a barrier as the Himalaya may be, it has made these exchanges and communications possible. It is the bounden duty of the two neighbors harboring the mountain space to protect it for their own survival, both material and spiritual. So it is in the interest of both the nations, or all the nations, South Asian nations, which are to use the phrase, at their doorstep. So yeah, and finally, the sage advice from His Holiness Dalai Lama while he was talking to students in 2000. Oh, I have gone too far in history. It should be 2013. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So he says that, and I quote, "In the past, India exported ideas. Buddhism, for example, spread across the whole of Asia. Now we need you to serve the world by sharing ahimsa and harmony. In the normal run of things to export, you have to increase production. So who will produce the ahimsa and harmony for export? It will have to be young people like all of you. This is an example of opportunity you have to create a better world. We really need to make an effort to spread inner peace through education." So this is what was referred to. This was 2013 Nature paper, which I said that why Himalaya must be protected, and what nations across the Himalaya and along the Himalaya need to do. I do not want to go. And last year I was doubly lucky to have another paper where I argued that this is the only way to protect this area, that it should be a huge nature reserve where everyone benefits. The rivers benefit, the glaciers benefit, the agricultural land which is in the Indo-Gangetic plains, that benefits. Everyone benefits if we take care of this upland. So that's the limited message. Thank you. I just want to stop here, and then we can have more discussion.
Raj, thank you very much. I think you've taken us beautifully from a very local issue and the impact on yaks as animals and the community that relies upon them, to the macro issue of protection of the Himalayas and the Himalayan Plateau in a very eloquent way. Thank you very much. I do agree with you. I think the more cooperation between two great civilizations, India and China, with what they have most in common, Buddhism originating from India, obviously, would be of tremendous benefit to everyone. It would be wonderful to see that in the form of some agreement, but the politics are most complicated. And in nature, in regard to the most complicated politics, I think it's appropriate we go to someone from Tibet, Tempa, who actually is in Dar es Salaam, I think, at the moment. So we're really privileged to have you, Tempa. Would you like to try and share your screen? I think you want to show us a few slides as well. Okay.
Great. So thank you very much to the organizers, and I want to thank the two previous speakers for giving a very, very interesting talk. So Dr. Martin Mills clearly gave a very important talk on the importance of Tibetan Plateau. So, and Professor Pandit Ji highlighted the risk of climate change, the impact of climate change has on the people, and also on plants and species. So what I'll try to do is I will try to highlight what's happening on the Tibetan Plateau and why it is why climate change is a serious issue on the plateau. Now, if you go next, now the impact of climate change is much more serious on the plateau than other regions. Why? Because of four basic factors. The factor number one, I would say, is the geographic landscape. So many of you who have been to Tibet would definitely know what the plateau looks like. So if you look at this, the picture on the screen, you clearly understand what the plateau looks like from sky. With 2.5 million square kilometers of area, the plateau is a massive region, and it covers almost 2% of Earth's land surface, which makes it, if it's an independent state, it would be the 10th largest country on Earth. It would be as big as many Western European countries combined. It's a massive land surface. Now, this massive land surface, which rises at an average elevation of more than 4,000 meters above sea level, makes it the largest as well as the highest plateau on Earth. Now, there's a significance to that part. Because of its massive land surface area at a very high elevation, the temperature rise on the plateau is always twice or occasionally twice the global average. Now then, the basic factor number two is geographical location. Now, the Tibetan Plateau is not only a massive surface area at a very high elevation, it is located at a very unique latitude and longitude location. Now, the plateau, which is located between 28 degrees north to 39 degrees north and 79 degrees east to 105 degrees east, it's very close to Tropic of Cancer, which means the climatic condition in that particular area is very hot and dry. So if you look to the places that to the west of Tibet, it's mostly deserted regions of the Arabian regions. So the Tibetan Plateau has this is highly vulnerable to desertification, number one. And also because of that high elevation, the intensity of sunlight is much greater than other regions. So this is the basic factor number two, why the climate change is much more serious on the plateau than the other regions. Then next, please. Now, then the basic factor number three is the past climate condition. Now, there's a beautiful saying that the present cultural way of life of any society is shaped by the climate condition of that region in the past. So, because of a very cold, dry climate condition that existed on the plateau for the last thousands of years, the way of life on the plateau is an adaptation to that particular climate condition. Now, what that has made is how the Tibetans build their homes, the form of agricultural practice, the way they build their homes, where they build their homes, everything is an adaptation to a very cold and dry climate condition. Now, this has serious implications. Now, the plateau is experiencing warmer and better climate conditions. Now, that means the way of life that we have adapted successfully for the last thousands of years may not be feasible in the coming years. And then the basic factor number four is the existing way of life. Now, the Tibetan Plateau, the population on the plateau has follows a two set of way of life. One nomadic way of life, now the agricultural way of life. Now, north and western regions of Tibet, which has a large grassland, practice nomadic way of life. But the region that is slightly lower in elevation and slightly warmer and more fertile practice agricultural way of life. But with increasing precipitation and increasing warming climate condition, there's increased glacial retreat, permafrost degradation. And the permafrost degradation has put nomadic way of life at risk because of desertification. Now, increased precipitation and also increased glacial retreat has temporarily supported better cultural way of life, and also somehow increased the fertility of the soil. But in the long term, it might put the Tibetan people on the lower regions at risk. Now, that's the four basic factors. Now, if you go next, now, what I would like to highlight is because of this basic four factors, and Tibet, the impact of climate change on the plateau has been really, really serious since 2015. So what we could say is the impact of climate change on the plateau has been happening since the 1950s. But because of the existing structure, existing glaciers or permafrost, the impact wasn't visible, but it was gradually building up. It was gradually building up for the last 40 or 50 years. But since 2015, the impact is clearly out there. When I was in Tibet, my parents and grandparents, they used to say, natural disasters and bad things would happen only in China, not in Tibet. That was the general thinking back in Tibet. Because the general climate condition was so stable. But since 2015, what used to happen in China is happening in Tibet. There has been floods, there has been landslides, there has been forest fires, there has been glacial avalanche. The picture you can see on the screen is basically a few incidents that happened in Tibet since 2050. And in the past, there might be floods in one particular region, but not other regions. But since 2015, floods were happening across the plateau. Landslides were happening across the plateau. Now, if you can go next. So what I will try to do is I will try to highlight that with 4 case examples. Now, case example number 1 is snow disaster. Now, Tibet, since 2050, Tibet experienced 2 very different forms of snow disaster. One, a snow disaster due to glacier avalanche. Now, this glacier avalanche, which happened twice, there were 12 glacier avalanche, which happened one in July, another one is in September, is basically during the summer. And scientists have found that that glacier avalanche, which killed more than 100 animals and a few families, nomadic families, were buried on the glaciers avalanche, was due to melting, due to increased warming temperature on the plateau and melting of the glaciers. But then to the other side, in 2019, there was a massive snowfall in the winter, which again killed thousands of animals in northern part of Tibet. Now, these are two very extreme sides of snow disaster. One happened in the summer, another happened in the winter. So extreme climate conditions happening across plateau. Now, why this is such a risk? This is risky because the Tibet Plateau has 14 great mountain ranges. So with 46,000 glaciers. And as Dr. Martin Mills clearly said, that it is the third largest glaciated region on Earth. So in the coming years, there would be many more glacier avalanches because almost across Tibet Plateau, there's a glaciated mountains ranges. So if you can go next. Now, I would skip that. Now, then the case example 2 is again two very different forms of floods. Now, there has been floods in Tibet in the past. So the historical texts clearly indicate there were floods. But these floods were on a particular river, not on all the rivers. But since 2015, most of the large Tibetan rivers were surging and causing floods to the nearby villages. So here, in July 2017, there was a massive flood massive flood in Jamdar region. A river that flowed through the Jamdar town caused collapse of many homes and also loss of life. Then there's another flood that was very unique and that was very terrifying to many Tibetans. It's a flooded Pasture. Now, what we need to understand is the summer pasture that Tibetan nomads position themselves is always slightly higher land. So a flooded pasture is very, very different, very new to the people. So this is basically because of melting permafrost, melting ground, and also surging nearby river and surging lakes. So these two extreme cases is also has serious implications because on the Tibetan Plateau, as two previous speakers mentioned, Tibetan Plateau is home to almost all of Asian rivers. And if you travel to Tibet, there are thousands of rivers, and almost all of Tibetan villages are located along the rivers. So surging rivers, flooding rivers means most part of Tibet would face floods in the summer in the coming years. Now, if you could go next.
So, sorry, Temper, would you mind if we skip a few slides and could we go down to your conclusion, because we have a couple of very good questions and I'd like to have time to bring them in.
Yes,
could we skip down to your conclusion slide at the end? Andrew,
yes.
The way forward, that would be terrific, thanks.
Okay, so what we need to do is, now because of the serious impact of climate change on the plateau, the Tibetan people need to adapt to our new climate condition because we have so very successfully lived on the plateau. We have been a powerful empire on the plateau, but now there's a new climate condition. It's warmer and better, and we need to adapt. Now, because Tibet is under Chinese occupation, we don't have that luxury or that right to do that. So the Chinese government has, as a colonial power, has the responsibility to frame proper policies, policy of mitigation. There's a clear lack of awareness and mitigation efforts by the Chinese government. And finally, the international community has to come together because the degradation or the destruction of the Tibet Plateau would not only have serious impact for the Tibetans, but it would have serious implication for China, for India, and across Asia who are dependent on Tibetan rivers and also the monsoon that is regulated by the Tibetan Plateau. With that, I conclude and hand back to the moderator. Thank you.
Tempa, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to skip through. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but perhaps we can bring you back for another webinar in the future, if you don't mind, and hear your full set of slides. I would like to ask several questions and bring the first two panelists back in. If I could lump a couple of the questions together, because we have quite a lot. So first of all, from Pablo de Castro, who suggests it's a bit of a naive question, but I think not. Could the climate crisis make it possible that China-India collaboration efforts on hydrometeorological research in the Tibetan Plateau receive at least as much media attention as the occasional skirmish on border control? Then if I could go on and make this a general thematic question, if you don't mind, from Kyle Marston, how do panelists perceive the Chinese Tianhe Sky River project? Should such ambiguous activities be regulated by international treaty? And thank you, Kyle, for being honest. Should I even be concerned about it? And lastly, to lump these three together, from Victoria Schofield, the idea of a nature reserve is wonderfully optimistic, but it goes against all nationalist instinct, which has become even more pronounced in recent years. So how would cooperation ever be possible? So I think all of those questions are somewhat linked. So perhaps Raj, as you're in Delhi and sort of at the pointy end of relations, which you've mentioned, certain culturally between India and China, would you like to say something about the prospect for overall cooperation and those three questions?
It's a very, very tricky and difficult question to answer because we are not taking decisions, number one. I think somebody who has asked this question has also mentioned that given the kind of nationalistic or jingoistic kind of narrative that develops, it keeps sane minds from even suggesting something. At the height of, last year when this skirmish or whatever you may call it, engagement, a very politically neutral statement to make happened. At that height, I published this paper and I did receive some amount of course, internationally it was liked that, wow, what a dream it was, this is all beautiful and all that. But then there was a bit of pushback, which I don't want to go back. Now, how do you get two factions who have diametrically opposite views of things which are somehow there on ground? Now, how to get them? Unless, this. I have argued in my 2013 Nature paper that unless and until we have a joint network on climate change, on hazard generation and data sharing, we can get into serious trouble. But is somebody listening? I really don't know. I think it needs more sociologists, possibly anthropologists, who can get two warring persons to shake hands or something like that, or the moral authority of a gentleman like Dalai Lama to sort of get them see the reason, and because he's heard everywhere, and if he lends his intellectual and other spiritual heft, I think then we would have got global attention to this. By publishing in it's not only one. At that point of time, we published this. Why should India and China? Because we argued in our science paper, which was again published last year, August. It was again a kind of a double gift, one paper in Science, one in Nature. So we argued in that if India and China do not participate, then this dream of sustainable world goes for a toss. Because not only are these two emerging economies central to the economic narrative, but also to natural resource consumption narrative. So unless and until, so they have no other option. In fact, we have no other option. In fact, there is another paper which is coming up in MBO where we have argued that why is it important, which is a longish paper, where we have argued that why is it important for Indian policymakers, Indian scientists, Indian researchers, Indian institutions. So I have recommended at 3 levels. One, as Buddha says, sangham sharanam gacchami, dharmam sharanam gacchami, sangham sharanam gacchami. One is at individual level. So we have to cooperate at individual level. Second is we have to cooperate at institutional level, because institutions are far greater than individuals. Then you have to actually cooperate at what is called the dhammic level or the ideal level. The ideal is to save this region from going extinct. So that's all.
Raj, thank you very much. We perhaps don't hear from His Holiness Dalai Lama as much as we could on this issue, and he is quite elderly. But certainly the next best thing is John Kerry, and he's clearly trying his best. But Martin, I don't want to ask you to also try and answer this question. I wonder if we could move on to another one or several more that are specifically put to you, in fact. And from Shashikant, apart from its effect on snow, permafrost and capacity to hold fresh water as a storage during the rest of the year, how would the warming of the Third Pole area likely affect monsoons that play a very critical role in the subcontinent? And if I may also bring in one from Robert Hadgart, it's estimated that if all of the Greenland ice sheet melted, world sea level would rise by 7 to 7.5 meters. Could you give an equivalent estimate for all ice on the Tibetan Plateau meeting? So obviously it's not, we don't really need a doomsday scenario, but I think it's just useful to put things in perspective and say a little more about the real outcomes as things worsen.
Well, I'm going to deal with that second question first, because it's such a big question. It speaks to a certain extent the way in which we, particularly in the North Atlantic corridor, understand the climate change problem. We understand it largely as a sea level issue. And we understand it as a weather issue. By comparison, if you go to Asia, the primary issues you're looking at there, as with actually, to be honest, much of America, is about the desertification and soil fertility and water capacities to actually produce food in fields. Okay, and that's actually, so while we're staring at the ocean, there are problems behind our backs as far as this is concerned. And this is about that kind of water question. One of the things, I spoke about was the way in which the Tibetan Plateau is holding water at the moment. And we know that, for example, as time is going on, the Tibetan Plateau is getting warmer. It's also getting wetter, I hasten to add. That process of accumulating water is probably a transitional phase that is a result of the permafrost collapse. But the truth of the matter is that what we're looking at, actually, our major problem is desertification as a consequence of all of this. That may sound counterintuitive, but the Tibetan Plateau is accumulating water and desertifying at the same time. And this is what happens when we start getting these complex climate change effects. We've effectively moved quite recently from stage 1, where we begin to see some climate change effects, to stage 2, where we see climate change effects combine on top of one another to produce complex and often unexpected results. Now, going back to and one of those, for example, is, the Tibetan Plateau's loss of ice is ultimately, but quite slowly, going to feed into the water level. Do we have a calculation on that? No, because we don't know enough. The reason why we don't know enough to a large extent relates to one of the other questions that people said was, how much was my 1960 map a guesstimate? Now that was one of the questions. It's a very, very good question, because on the Tibetan Plateau, there are weather stations and hydrology stations and permafrost measuring stations only in the places that serve precisely as early warning for industry for the People's Republic of China. This, of course, is a rational thing to do. But what it means is that those sort of stations tend to be, for example, on the eastern Tibetan Plateau, as rivers flow down into the Chinese mainland, and along the railway, which is bringing products that are doing it. Consequently, there's actually a huge amount we don't know about the rest of this huge area of land. And this is where the question of international scientific cooperation really becomes vital, because as a consequence, you know, there's knowledge for sort of going as the water goes out one door, but we don't know how it's going out the other doors, as it were. And we need to know far, far more for the sake of India, for the sake of Pakistan, for the sake of Nepal, Bangladesh, all of those countries with huge populations. We know, for example, that Indus is destabilizing massively. If we really lose the Indus, we lose Pakistan and the Punjab, which is a major breadbasket for India. Those are huge issues with mass migration problems associated with it. But we don't know enough. We know enough to know it's a problem. You know, it's a little like, and if you'll excuse the analogy, you know, we know that from 9/11, we know that flying a plane into a very tall building is a bad idea. But there wasn't an architect in the world that could have told you how those towers came down. They didn't anticipate that particular kind of catastrophic collapse under gravity. Now, the Tibetan Plateau is a water tower that is very high up under gravity, and gravity is what is affecting much of this. So these patterns are, at the moment, unanticipated. The Chinese themselves have actually put in place what they refer to as nature reserves. I would be careful about the word. They moved huge nomadic populations, in particular, off headland river areas, because basically speaking, your Development 101 books would have told them to do that because of the desertification. What they discovered later was it wasn't the cause, but they'd already depopulated an area the size of France. I mean, this is one of the things business people, everybody needs to understand, is that climate scientists and development specialists are tearing up the how-to books at the moment, because the future is looking, and the way in which it works is looking increasingly uncertain.
Martin, thanks. I didn't want to go to too many of the technical questions, because I know you could speak for a great deal longer. But I think, as you said, the known unknowns, perhaps, of what will happen, and that comparison to the architectural impact on the World Trade Center is something we should be thoughtful about. We know that we don't know what might happen, the extent of what might happen. That's the most troubling part of the problem with the third pole. Lastly, as we're running over, but I'd like to bring Tempa back in. And Tempa, if I could, we have a question from Adrian Lovett, who is from Tibet Support Group and the One Planet Group. And he says, we're trying to think global, especially about the third pole, but act local. So from his group, we're honored to be part of the Global Tree Initiative. We plant trees every year for this, and globally in 50 countries, this campaign has planted over 250,000 trees, on the way to a target of 1 million trees to be planted to honor His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And his question is, and so this is a wider one for you, but I think it's relevant with where you are in Dar es Salaam as a Tibetan, that we do not think this is enough. Are there other things we should be doing locally, as well as trying to persuade people over the world to think and act globally? So would you like to say something about how you see this as a Tibetan from Dharamsala, thinking locally but acting globally? Your guidance would be most useful, I think.
Thank you very much, Martin. I want to thank the person who asked the question, and I want to thank his or her effort on tree plantation. This is something that we here at the Tibet Policy Institute have been pushing for in Tibet, and asking Tibetans in Tibet to carry forward tree plantation. And His Holiness has always said tree plantation is very important. So this is something that I want to add to what Pandit Ji and Martin yourself have said, that His Holiness has in fact one of the most prominent environmentalists, something that I think two of you might not have been familiar with. So this is because His Holiness is one person who's probably the earliest prominent personality who supported environment efforts. That's why he was awarded Nobel Peace Prize on one account, because of environment efforts. And also, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has delivered messages at almost every UN climate summit. And in 2018, I was the one who carried one of that message. And this year, His Holiness also delivered a message. Now, His Holiness has always said that the Tibet people, the Chinese government, can and should work together on climate and environment issues. And His Holiness has very famously said that climate change and environment has no geographical or national boundaries. It is an issue that we all must and should come together. So that's why I have always said that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is the most consistent environmentalist who's not trying to be in the limelight, but always pushing for environment conservation. And also Tibetan Plateau, if we are able to protect Tibetan Plateau, then we are protecting the rivers of North India. We are protecting rivers of all of China's rivers. And then we are protecting the rivers of Southeast Asian countries. So this is urgently needed, and this is what we are pushing for at the COP26. And my colleagues there, and we are asking the United Nations to recognize the global ecological importance of the Tibetan Plateau and make it center to any climate change discussion. It's for the good of the world that they need to do it. With that, I'll get back to you.
Thank you very much, Tempa. I really appreciate it. I'm so sorry, Tempa and Dr. Mills and Dr. Pandit, that we haven't had more time to ask more questions and also to give all of you time to speak longer. But as I said, here in the UK, many people join at lunchtime, so I think we'll have people dropping off to go back to work. So I really am grateful for your insights and the time you've taken to call in from Gurgaon, from Dharamsala, and from Aberdeen. And if I could just hand back to our chairman, Roddy Gowell, for closing. Roddy, are you?
Martin, yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much, panelists, for what has been a simply intriguing and really rather alarming overview of what's going on in the third pole. And also, it's such an appropriate time to be looking at this. I've been attending some of the COP26 meetings in Glasgow, and we hope that the world is coming to its senses and the people that are there will not, in the inevitable words of that well-known young lady, all be blah, 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 and nothing actually being resolved. But you've highlighted for us, those following at the Asia Scotland Institute, an area of extreme concern, where by taking steps, something could be done about this. And not very many people knew about the third pole. I certainly didn't. And what we have heard today has been enormously informative. And for that, we thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Martin.